Hitler at one point said, "I only hold my rallies at night because that's when people will let their emotions loose."
I'm sitting here with Andrew Nagorski, who has written this fascinating new book, Hitlerland, about the American correspondence in pre-war and during the war Germany at the time of Hitler. And Andy, who are the heroes of your book?
There's several, I think, real heroes of the book. One is an early correspondent, Edgar Ansel Maurer of the Chicago Daily News, who's incredibly courageous, saw very early where the Nazis were going, where Hitler was going, and then tried actually to warn Jews, for instance, to get out of Germany before Hitler took power. William Shirer later on. I also deal with some of the diplomats, the writers. George Messersmith was a famous U.S. consul general who warned against Hitler. But it's interesting, a lot of people are not just straight heroes or villains here. They are trying to figure out who Hitler represents. And some of the earliest people who made Hitler in the early 1920s, before most people have even heard of Hitler, are very perceptive about what an effective demagogue he is. But then later on, when Hitler is gaining power, and some famous Americans like Dorothy Parker meet Hitler, and they think, this guy's too weird. He's never going to get power. The Germans are never going to elect him. He's weird. He goes off on these rants. He has jerky motions. He's quote unquote effeminate, and he will be outmaneuvered by the manly politicians of Germany. It's interesting that there's not a straight trajectory of understanding who Hitler is.
There are quite a lot of very interesting Nazi characters in your book. Goering, who is this unbelievably kind of bullying, kind of blowhard character, and then Putzi Hafstangl, who is Hitler's first flak, really. Yeah. Which of these characters did you become particularly beguiled or seduced by as you were writing about them, if I may say that about such unpleasant human beings?
Right. Well, Putzi Hafstangl is a particularly interesting character because here's a guy whose father was Bavarian, his mother was from a very eminent Bostonian family, or his grandfather was a Civil War general, even carried Lincoln's coffin. And he goes to Harvard, class of 1909. He comes back to Germany in 1921, becomes close friends with Hitler, as does his wife, Helen, who is American born and bred, although her parents had originally come from Germany. And here he is, he's playing Harvard marching songs to Hitler in the early days, and he's telling him how to rouse the crowd. In the meantime, Hitler is fascinated by Helen Hafstangl.
I know there's a real sense that Hitler really was in love with Helen.
He may have been, in his own way, as she says. She considered him as a quote-unquote neuter sexually. There's a whole raft of literature on what Hitler's sexual proclivities were. But in any case, I describe this moment in Hitlerland where after the failed beer hall putsch, when Hitler has this disastrous attempt to take power and several Nazis are killed, he ends up at Helen Hafstangl's house, and the police are closing in, and Helen actually talks him out of committing suicide. This is 1923. Imagine what the history of the last century would have been like if this American woman had not stopped Hitler from committing suicide.
I know, it's an incredible moment of history not taken, as it were. I think it was Shirer who says in the book that he kept having to go back to the fascination with Hitler and ask himself, would the Nazi movement ever really have got the traction without Hitler at the leadership? What is your feeling from having read the accounts?
What really struck me was we tend to see these little clips of Hitler ranting and say, what could this all be about? And in a way, Shirer's initial reaction to Hitler was the same thing. He saw him, what's the attraction? And then he begins to watch him in the way he orchestrates these events. We've all seen the Nuremberg rallies and so forth. And he realizes that without Hitler, I think Germany would never have gone the route of the Third Reich, the Holocaust. It may have been a military dictatorship, there may have been brutalities, murders, and so forth, but nothing on the scale of what happened. It was Hitler's personality, sheer force of personality, that made that happen. And that comes through in the accounts of the Americans in Hitlerland.
One of the things that I find fascinating is to ask ourselves the question of the spell that he seemed to cast over the whole British nation. I mean, almost like one by one, people just abandon their own kind of moral qualms and just fall into step. What was it about that spell, you think, that he was casting at that time?
Well, one of the interesting things is that the people who bothered to spend some time observing Hitler closely, including Putzi Hafstangl, including William Shirer, including Truman Smith, for instance, who was a young military attaché in 1922, was the first American diplomat to meet Hitler. Actually, when they observed him, they realized he'd come to a beer hall or a rally, and he would begin very softly, very conversationally, and gradually really ratchet up the emotions and play on every insecurity and every kind of nationalistic feeling there was. And he was a master of this. In fact, Hitler at one point said, "I only hold my rallies at night because that's when people will let their emotions loose. In the evening, you're much more engaged." And that's what he worked on. It's pretty perceptive psychologically and pretty scary.
Well, your book is full of such fascinating insights, Andrew, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tina.